If you want to know
It's
who
so
the
good
most
to see
dangerous
you.
person in
You
any
too.
room
I've
is,
missed this.
don't
How
look
have
at
you
the biggest
been?
one.
Good,
Don't
really
look at
good.
the loudest one.
This place hasn't
Don't look
changed
at
a
the
bit,
one
has
with the
it?
nicest
Not one
clothes or the
bit, just like the
shiniest
good old
watch
days.
I'm
or
so
the
glad we
voice that
came
fills
back.
up all the
You
empty
think you can
space and
just walk
expects the
away?
room to be
I
grateful
earned that
for it.
right.
Look at
Boys,
the one
not
who is
here.
sitting
This isn't
quietly.
over.
Look
Bring
at
it.
the one nobody is paying
You
attention
can't
to.
keep
Look at
ignoring
the one
us.
who
This
has
is my
already
place. I'm
seen
not selling.
everything,
Then you leave
already
me no
counted
choice.
everything, already decided
Oh, how
everything,
sweet.
and is simply waiting for the right
There you
moment to
go.
arrive.
Thank you,
That is the
dear.
one you need to worry about. That is the one you should never, ever underestimate. Because by the time you figure out who they really are, it is already too late. This is a story about a Tuesday morning in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is a story about a diner that smelled like bacon grease and old coffee and 40 years of working people starting their days with something warm. It is a story about a man who walked into that diner thinking he owned the world, and a woman who let him keep thinking that right up until the moment she decided he had had enough rope. And it is a story about a son who drove his Harley across 3 counties and arrived before his mother did because she had called him the night before and told him exactly where to be. Not because she was afraid, because she had a plan. Her name was Eleanor Mack. Everyone who knew her called her Ellie. She was 72 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and she weighed somewhere around 130 pounds in her winter coat. She had white hair she kept pinned up every morning, not for appearances, but because that was what her mother had taught her, and she had never found a reason to change it. She had brown eyes still sharp behind the small oval glasses she had worn for 20 years, and she had the kind of face that strangers looked at and thought grandmother. Sweet old lady, harmless. That was the first mistake people made about Ellie Mack. The second mistake was thinking that because she did not talk much, she was not listening. She was always listening. She had worked as a seamstress for 35 years in a small alteration shop 2 blocks from the house where she raised her son. 35 years of sitting at a machine that required absolute precision and absolute patience, a seam off by a 1/4 inch, a hem that dipped on the left side, a button that did not line up with the hole. 35 years of training herself to see what other people missed. 35 years of understanding that the difference between something done right and something done wrong was usually invisible to everyone except the person who knew what they were looking for. She had buried her husband, Frank, 11 years ago. She had lived alone since then in the small house they bought together in 1987, the one with the blue shutters in the garden she kept up every summer because Frank had loved tomatoes, and she still grew them even though there was no one left to eat them all. She gave most of them to the neighbors. She did not mind. She drove a 2009 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. The air conditioning had stopped working 3 summers ago, and she kept meaning to fix it and never quite did. The car got her where she needed to go. That was enough. Every Tuesday morning for 9 years, she drove to Keller's Diner on Ridgeway Avenue and ordered the same thing, 2 slices of white toast, 1 egg over easy, and a cup of black coffee. She always sat at the same table, the 2-top by the front window on the left side of the room, the one that caught the morning light in a way that made even a gray Pittsburgh day feel like something worth getting up for. She always left $5 and a $1 tip counted out and ready before Maya even brought the check. Keller's was the kind of place that does not exist in many cities anymore. 12 tables a counter with 8 stools, all the same dark green vinyl they had been since 1978, repaired over the decades with strips of matching tape that had faded to a slightly different shade of green, so the whole thing looked like a patchwork map of small disasters survived. The walls had photographs, Pittsburgh bridges, Steelers teams from the 70s and 80s, a faded picture of Roberto Clemente that had been hanging behind the register since the day the owner's father opened the place. The coffee came in thick white mugs that had been washed 10,000 times and were none the worse for it. Hal Keller was 61 years old and had worked in this building since he was 16. His father had opened the diner in 1971 and run it until his heart gave out in 2003, at which point Hal, who had been doing construction and thought he was finished with the restaurant business, came back and bought it from the estate because he could not stand the idea of someone else tearing it apart. He had been here ever since. He knew every regular by name. He knew what they ordered before they sat down. He knew who was going through something hard and needed an extra minute before he approached the table. And he knew who just wanted their coffee fast and their eggs faster and their check waiting before they finished eating. He knew Ellie Mack. He had known her for 9 years. He knew she took her coffee black, that she read quietly and never stayed more than 45 minutes, that she tipped consistently and thanked people by name. He did not know much else about her life. She was private in the way certain people are private, not because they are hiding anything, but because they have learned over many years that their inner life belongs to them and not to the world. He had never in 9 years asked about the silver ring on her right hand, the simple band with two words engraved on the inside just barely visible when the light caught it at the right angle. Ride free. Maya had noticed it once years ago and decided not to ask. Some things about people are theirs alone, and a good waitress understands that the best service is sometimes knowing what not to touch. On the Tuesday morning this story begins, Ellie Mack arrived at Keller's at 8:43. She pushed open the glass door with the bell above it that had been ringing the same two-note chime since 1994. She nodded at Dennis through the kitchen window. Dennis, who was built like a refrigerator and had the gentlest hands for a man that size, and believed without exception that slightly crispier bacon was always correct regardless of what anybody ordered. She said good morning to Maya, who was already on her second pot of coffee and had the pleasantly exhausted look of someone who had been up since 5 and did not mind it. Then she looked around the room, not the way a person looks around when they are searching for someone, the way a person looks around when they are confirming what they already expect to find. At the far end of the counter, the last stool near the wall, a large man in a black jacket was sitting with his back to the room, both hands around a coffee mug, looking at nothing in particular. He had arrived before her. He had been there since 8:30. She did not look at him for more than a second. She did not walk over to him. She looked at her table, the two top by the window on the left side, and found it occupied. 3 men had spread themselves across it, and the table beside it, papers and laptops and phones covering every surface, the claiming of space that certain people perform without thinking, because they have never once been asked to account for how much room they take up. She settled at a different table without complaint, the foretop near the door with the slight wobble in the left rear leg. She set her bag on the chair beside her and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug that Maya brought without being asked, because Maya had been doing this for 3 years and some things did not need to be requested. Across the room near the far wall, a woman had been sitting since 8:15, a full half hour before the morning rush. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a cardigan the color of old brick, a paperback open in front of her. 58 years old, 29 years teaching 8th grade English in the Pittsburgh public schools before she retired 3 years ago. Her name was Donna Reese, and she had ordered a coffee and a bran muffin, and she looked to anyone who happened to glance her way like exactly what she appeared to be, a retired school teacher enjoying a quiet Tuesday morning with a book she had brought from home. When Ellie walked in, Donna looked up. Their eyes met for 2 seconds, the brief exchange of people who know each other outside of wherever they currently are, and then Donna looked back down at her book. Nobody noticed. Also in the room, George Tamboli, 67 years old, retired 6 years from the Clairton Steel Mill, where he had worked for 34. He sat at the two-top near the window with a folded newspaper and a cup of coffee, and he looked like a man who had nowhere to be and was making the best of it, which was true, and which he had not yet fully made peace with. His wife Marion had been a nurse 32 years in the ICU, and she had died 4 years ago, and since then, the mornings had been quiet in a way George had not adjusted to and probably never would. He came to Keller's because the alternative was sitting in a house that was too quiet and reading the newspaper in a kitchen where the other chair had not been used in 4 years. He was good at minding his own business. He had learned that a long time ago at the mill, where minding your own business was the thing that got you through a shift without trouble. He had been doing it so long, it had become something close to a principle. What happened next was small. The first small thing always is. The 3 men at the corner table, the ones with the papers and the laptops and the phones, had been talking since before they sat down, the conversation of people who consider themselves perpetually in the middle of something important. The one doing most of the talking was 39 years old and had the casual authority of someone who had spent his 30s accumulating advantages in the habit of being accommodated. He wore a shirt with a small logo on the chest that cost more than Dennis made in 2 shifts. His watch had a face so large, it was closer to a clock than a watch. His name was Derek Hollis. The second man, wider, red-faced with a laugh he deployed too quickly and too often, was Craig Beaumont, who had been Derek's friend since college and whose social identity for the past 15 years had been built almost entirely around that fact. He laughed now at something Derek said a half-second before he had processed whether it was funny. The third man was younger, mid-20s, with the careful posture of someone who had recently started a job that required him to agree with people he was not always sure he agreed with. His name was Nate, and he was looking at his own phone with the focused intensity of someone who is not reading anything important but needs to appear occupied. Craig Beaumont reached across 2 feet of space and picked up the sugar dispenser from Ellie's table. He did not ask. He did not look at her. He simply reached over and picked it up as though it were a thing available for the taking, like a napkin from an empty table or a chair nobody was using. Ellie needed the sugar. She took her coffee black, but she used half a spoonful in her orange juice, which she had ordered today because she thought she might be coming down with something. She had been looking forward to it. She looked at where the sugar had been. Then she looked at Craig Beaumont. She said, in a voice that was level and clear, "Excuse me, I'm still using that." Craig looked over at her. He took in the white hair and the bun and the oval glasses and the small woman in the old cardigan and the hands wrapped around the coffee mug, and something happened in his face that was not quite a sneer, but lived in that neighborhood. "At your age," he said, "probably better off without it." He laughed. The laugh was for Derek's benefit as much as anything. "Look at me. Look how quick I am." And Derek glanced up briefly from his laptop, registered the situation, registered Ellie, and looked back down. Not because he had made any decision about her, but because she did not rise to the level of a decision. She was simply there, like the furniture, like the old photographs on the walls. Ellie looked at Craig Beaumont for 3 seconds, not with anger, not with hurt, not with the look that asks for an apology or hopes for one. She looked at him the way she looked at a seam that had been done wrong, noting it, categorizing it, filing it away, and then she looked out the window at the gray Pittsburgh morning and the 2 pigeons on the sidewalk, conducting their argument with the absolute conviction of creatures who have never once doubted that their dispute is the most important thing happening on Earth. George Tamboli across the room had seen it. He looked at Ellie. He looked at Craig. He turned the page of his newspaper. The morning continued. Kellers filled up the way it always did on Tuesday's tables, claiming themselves one by one the counter stools taken by the same people who always took them, the sound level rising from early morning quiet to the low, comfortable noise of a room full of people eating and talking and existing alongside each other without requiring anything in particular from one another. The postal worker in his jacket took the stool near the door and ordered eggs over medium and whole wheat toast, and Dennis started them without being asked. An older woman spread her crossword puzzle at the back table with the dedication of someone who has elevated this daily activity to something close to a meditation. A young family came in, parents in their early 30s, a girl of about 5 and a boy of about 3, who was carrying a stuffed dog that had clearly been through some things. They came in with the slightly apologetic energy that parents of small children carry in public places, aware of the room they take up, hoping to be accommodated. Maya smiled at them and looked around for a table. The room was nearly full. The most reasonable option was to ask the men in the corner to consolidate. They had papers spread across 2 full tables, one of which was otherwise empty. Maya walked over and asked politely the way she asked everything, acknowledging that a request was being made, leaving room for a reasonable person to respond reasonably. Derek Hollis ended his phone call. He set the phone face up on the table. He looked at Maya. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. The shift that happens when a person decides a line has been crossed and that crossing it will have consequences. "Do you know who I am?" he said. The room did not go silent. What happened was subtler, a slight adjustment in attention, the way people register a change in a conversation's tone without fully turning toward it. Maya said she did not, but there were customers waiting who needed a table, and she wondered if it might be possible. "I signed the paperwork this week," Derek said, "for this building. I own the building your little diner is sitting in." He said it the way people say things when they want the room to hear, without making an announcement to the room. "The lease your boss has on this space runs out in March," he continued. "I haven't decided whether I'm going to renew it." He picked up his phone again. "So I'd think carefully about who you're asking to move." Maya stood at the edge of the table. She was good at not showing what she felt 3 years of waitressing had given her practice. She nodded once, turned, and began rearranging other tables to try to make the 2 top work for the family. Hal came out of the kitchen. He had heard it from the pass-through window. 30 years of running a diner had calibrated him to changes in the room's atmosphere the way some people are calibrated to changes in weather. He came out with the unhurried walk of a man who is not going to do anything stupid, but is not going to pretend he did not hear what he just heard. He looked at Derek Hollis. Derek looked at him. "I was explaining the situation to your server," Derek said. Not unkindly, almost reasonably, the tone of a man who considers himself the adult in every room he enters. "Robert Franklin sold the building 3 weeks ago. You'll be receiving formal notice from my attorney's office by the end of the month." Robert Franklin had owned this building since 1989. He had been for 31 years the kind of landlord who was almost invisible, fair rent things fixed when they broke, no interference. He was 73 years old and he had died 6 weeks ago, a heart attack on a Wednesday night in front of the television. His son Jimmy had called Hal the next morning. Hal had gone to the service. He had brought flowers. He had not spoken to Jimmy since. Jimmy Franklin, Hal said, is 26 years old. His father died 6 weeks ago. Derek nodded slowly, the patience of a man who was being very generous with his time. These things happen. The sale was legal and properly documented. When did he sign? That's a matter between me and Mr. Franklin. When, Hal said again, quieter this time. Derek picked up his phone. The room had gone still in the way rooms go still when a conversation has moved somewhere, that most conversations don't go in public, somewhere that makes ordinary people feel the weight of what is being said, even when they don't know all the facts. George Tamboli set his newspaper flat on the table. He did not pick it up again. The boy with the stuffed dog was watching Derek with the unguarded curiosity of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned that watching is impolite. At her table near the door, Ellie Mack set down her toast. She looked at Derek Hollis not as though she was surprised, but as though she was confirming something she had already worked out. Then, without any hurry, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out her phone, an older model with a cracked corner she had been meaning to fix for over a year. She looked at it. She typed something. It took her perhaps 30 seconds. She put the phone back in her pocket. George Tamboli saw her do it. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, straightening the edge of a napkin that did not need straightening. He looked back at his newspaper. He did not pick it up. The room settled back into its routines. People went to their food and their phones and their conversations. Hal returned to the kitchen, the walk of a man who needs to do something with his hands before he says something he cannot take back. Maya moved between tables with her coffee and her composure, and the Tuesday night class she was not going to let this morning make her forget about. In the corner near the window, Donna Reese had closed her book. It was still open in her hands, held at reading angle pages facing outward. But she was not reading. Her phone was on the table beside the book, and it had been there since she sat down, and the screen was on, and it had been on for some time, facing a direction that took in the corner table and the men around it and most of the center of the room. Nobody was looking at Donna. Nobody had looked at Donna since she sat down. That was in its way exactly what she had come here to accomplish. 12 minutes passed. Derek and Craig had been gathering their documents for a few minutes, the way men like Derek gather things, which is to say without particular care for the space around them, papers shuffled into approximate piles, folders snapped shut, a general assembly of their presence back into something portable. They were finishing here. They had what they came for, or thought they did. A folder slipped. It caught the edge of the table wrong and fell, spilling a fan of papers across the floor, landing partly under Ellie's table, partly in the narrow aisle between them. Ellie looked at the papers. She looked at the man who had dropped them. She did what a 72-year-old woman with good manners and a lifetime's training in handling things with care does when something falls near her. She bent down and picked them up. She collected the pages with precision, not because they deserved it, but because that was who she was. She squared the edges. She held the folder out toward Derek Hollis. He looked at her hand. He looked at the folder, and then he looked at Ellie Mack, really looked at her for the first time since he had walked into this room, and he reached out and yanked the folder from her hand with the force of a man who is not angry at the thing he is grabbing, but at the person holding it. "Don't touch my things," he said, not loudly, conversationally, which somehow made it worse. And honestly, he looked at her, the sweater, the bun, the glasses, the small worn hands that had just done him a kindness he had no intention of acknowledging. "You look like you wandered in off the street. What is Hal doing letting people like you sit in here?" Craig laughed. The sound came out of him before he'd processed whether the moment called for it. Nate looked at the table in front of him. The room went quiet. Not the sudden silence of a dramatic moment, but the heavier silence of something said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present deciding what to do with it. The family with the small children had gone still. The woman with the crossword had put her pen down. The postal worker at the counter was looking at his coffee. George Tamboli looked at his hands. He looked at them on the table in front of him, the hands that had made steel for 34 years, the scarred palms and the thick knuckles, and the slight tremor that had been there every morning since he turned 65. He looked at them, and then he looked at Ellie, and then he looked back at his hands. He did not stand up. Not yet. Ellie Mack looked at Derek Hollis. She did not look hurt. She did not look frightened. She did not look like a woman waiting to be rescued or hoping someone would say something on her behalf. She looked at him with the settled attention of a woman who has spent 72 years learning exactly who she is and has arrived sometime in the last decade at the specific piece of someone who no longer needs the world to recognize it. She knew what she knew. She had come here knowing it. Nothing Derek Hollis had said or done in the past hour had changed any of it. She stood up, deliberately, without rushing. She smoothed the front of her sweater with both hands, the gesture of a woman putting herself back in order, not because she had been disordered, but because order was simply how she moved through the world. She reached into her pocket and took out a $5 bill and a single. She placed them on the table edge to edge flat and precise, the way a person places something when they mean it. Then she looked at Derek Hollis. "Thank you for an interesting morning, Mr. Hollis," she said. Her voice was level, conversational, the voice of a woman making a small social observation before she goes about her day. And she had used his name, his full last name, the name no one in this room had spoken to him, the name he had not given to anyone at this counter, had not introduced himself with, had not used in any exchange inside this building. She knew it. She had known it when she walked in. Derek Hollis went very still. Craig's laugh died somewhere in his throat. The reflex had run out of fuel. Ellie picked up her bag and settled it on her shoulder and turned and walked toward the door. 8 steps. She had taken 3 of them. Derek pushed back from the table. He moved with the forward momentum of a man who has decided that something requires correction, that the situation has slipped from where it should be and needs to be recovered. He moved through the room and stepped in front of her, between her and the door, too close in the deliberate way of someone who understands that physical space is its own language, that crowding a smaller person is a message, that making someone feel small is sometimes the entire point. He looked down at her. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Something had changed in his voice. Not rage, something colder than rage. The voice of a man who is used to controlling situations and is becoming aware in a way he has not yet fully named even to himself that this one is not behaving the way situations are supposed to behave. The woman in front of him had not flinched when he insulted her, had not hurried when she stood up, had called him by his name and thanked him for the morning as though she were the one who had been hosting it. It had gotten under his skin in a way he could not articulate and did not try to. Ellie looked up at him. She did not step back. She did not look away. She looked at him with the absolute stillness of someone who made a decision some years ago that there is no version of this kind of moment that requires her to make herself smaller, and has not revisited it since. Derek Hollis reached out and grabbed a fistful of her white hair and pulled. The sound she made was involuntary, short, sharp, the sound the body produces before the mind can decide whether to produce it. She grabbed the edge of the nearest table to keep from going down. Her glasses shifted. Her bag swung. The room went rigid. 20 people had watched the whole sequence, the insult, the name, the blocking of the door, and now this. And not one of them had moved. Some were standing and had not noticed they were standing. Some were sitting and had not noticed they had not moved. The social machinery that manages human behavior in public spaces had encountered something it was not designed to process and had simply stopped. George Tamboli was on his feet. He did not know when he had stood up. He was simply standing at his full height, with his hands at his sides and the newspaper on the table behind him, and 34 years of a working life in his body and the face of his wife, Marion. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Marion, who would have been standing before any of this started, who would never have read the newspaper through any of it, who would have said what needed saying in the first 30 seconds and walked away, and that would have been the end of it. He was standing now. Donna Reese had not moved from her corner table. She was watching the room the way a teacher watches a room, all of it simultaneously, the particular attention that comes from 29 years of managing 38th graders at once. Her phone was still on the table. The screen was still on. Maya's hand had gone to her mouth. Hal stood in the kitchen doorway with one hand on the frame, knuckles white. And at the far end of the counter chair, the last stool near the back wall, where a large man in a black leather jacket had been sitting with both hands around a coffee mug since 8:30, watching the reflection of the entire room in the window above the counter, a chair scraped back. The sound of boot heels on old linoleum. Slow, one step, then another. The rhythm of someone who is not hurrying, because hurrying is not the point, because the point is the arrival, not the speed of it, and the arrival was always going to happen exactly when it happens. George Tamboli said later, when he had told this story more times than he could count, the thing that stayed with him was not the confrontation, not the man in the jacket crossing the room, not even the moment everything turned. What stayed with him was the realization that the man had not looked surprised. Not when Derek moved toward Ellie, not when he grabbed her, not at any point in the whole sequence. He had looked like a man watching the last scene of a film he had already seen, confirming, rather than discovering, present for the completion of something that had been in motion long before anyone else in the room knew it had started. He knew, George said. He knew exactly what was going to happen because she had told him. The footsteps crossed the room, and no one in Keller's diner moved. No one looked anywhere except at the large man walking toward the corner where Derek Hollis was standing with a fistful of an old woman's hair, in a room full of people who had just watched him take it in a building he believed he owned on a Tuesday morning he had been certain was going to go entirely his way. He had been wrong about the morning. He had been wrong about the room. And he had been most completely, most consequentially wrong about the woman. He was not the biggest man most people in that room had ever seen, but he was close. 6 feet 3 inches, somewhere in the neighborhood of 230 pounds, with the kind of build that doesn't come from a gym and a protein supplement, but from years of physical work, in the particular way that certain bodies settle into themselves over time. Dense, deliberate, the kind of mass that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. He wore a black leather jacket over a plain dark shirt, worn jeans and boots that had seen more miles than most cars. His hair was cut short, and his beard was the salt and pepper of a man in his late 40s who has stopped caring about such things if he ever did. His eyes were a medium brown that would have been unremarkable in another face, but in this one were the detail you notice first because they were doing something unusual. They were completely still, not blank, not cold exactly. Still the way deep water is, still the way a room is still in the moment before something is said that will change everything in it. The eyes of a man who is not deciding what to do, who has already decided, who decided in fact before he walked through the door this morning and has been waiting with the patience of someone for whom waiting is not a passive condition, but simply another form of readiness. He crossed the room in the time it took Derek Hollis to register that someone was crossing it. He stopped 2 steps away, not touching distance, not yet, but close enough that Derek had to look up, had to physically adjust the angle of his gaze upward. And that small mechanical adjustment, the tilt of the head, the neck going back, produced in Derek's body an involuntary response that his brain hadn't authorized and couldn't quite suppress. He let go of Ellie's hair, not because he'd made a decision to. His hands simply opened. The way a hand opens when the body understands something the mind is still catching up to. Ellie straightened. She adjusted her glasses with one hand. She did not put the other hand to her head, though the place where the hair had been pulled was throbbing in a way she would feel for the rest of the day. She did not look at her son, not yet. She looked forward at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who is gathering herself, not because she is falling apart, but because precision matters and she intends to be precise. The large man in the black jacket looked at Derek Hollis. The room held itself in place. He said 2 words, 3 syllables. His voice was low, not quiet, but low in the way of something that doesn't need to be raised to fill a space because the space is already paying attention. Let go. Present tense. As though the action had not already happened. As though he was giving Derek the credit of the action being voluntary, the courtesy of the pretense that Derek had made a choice. Derek Hollis had not had many experiences in his adult life of being physically intimidated. He was not a small man. He had the casual confidence of someone who had moved through the world for nearly 4 decades without ever being in a situation where his body felt insufficient. He had money and authority, and the habit of those things which together create a particular kind of armoring that is usually adequate. It was not adequate right now. He took 1 step back. He did not appear to decide to take it. His body simply redistributed itself, recalibrated to a distance that felt manageable, and Derek Hollis stood in the new distance and tried to look like he'd chosen it. Craig Beaumont had gone very quiet. The automatic laugh mechanism had shut down completely. He was standing a full table's width away from where he'd been, and he was not entirely sure when he'd moved there. Nate had his eyes on the floor. The man in the black jacket crouched down beside Ellie. He did it with the particular economy of motion of someone who has done this kind of movement enough times in enough different circumstances that it's simply a position, not a gesture. He looked at her face. He checked her glasses. He looked at her hands, which were steady. He said quietly, a register lower than anyone else in the room could quite hear, "You okay?" Ellie said, "I'm fine." The 2 words of a woman who is not minimizing the situation but is reporting it accurately. She was fine. She was upright. She was present. She was exactly where she had intended to be this morning. He studied her for another second. Then he stood back up. He looked at Derek Hollis. George Tamboli was still on his feet at his table in the posture of a man who has not decided yet what he's doing, but has gotten up because sitting down was no longer possible. He watched the large man rise to his full height and look at Derek Hollis, and what George noticed, what he would describe later, with a precision that surprised him, because he was not usually a man who paid close attention to the subtleties of how people held themselves, was that the man never squinted, never tensed his jaw, never did any of the things that faces do when they are generating or containing anger. He simply looked at Derek the way you look at a map when you're confirming a route you've already planned. Informational. Complete. Derek said, "I don't know who you are, but you need to understand." "That's her table," the man said. "Just that." He said it the way you state a fact about geography or weather. The corner table by the window, the one with the morning light. The one that has been her table for 9 years that was taken this morning by a man who didn't ask, who didn't know, and wouldn't have cared if he did know. That's her table. Derek blinked. He had prepared in the 3 seconds since this man had stood up from the counter stool a series of responses about the building, about his lawyer, about the nature of public establishments, and who had the right to sit where, about this being a conversation that was going to go badly for the other party, and none of them were organized around the statement that had just been made, which was so simple and so outside the register of what he'd expected that it temporarily derailed the whole prepared sequence. I don't care whose. She's been coming here 9 years, the man said. Every Tuesday, same table. He was not explaining this as an argument. He was saying it the way a person says a thing they want on record. The way you speak when you know someone is listening, when you want the information to exist in the room, heard by everyone present. Then he said, she's my mother. 3 words. The room absorbed them. And something happened in the understanding of everyone who heard it. Not a dramatic shift, not a gasp, but the quiet and significant rearrangement that occurs when 2 separate things you've been holding in your mind suddenly connect, and the picture they make together is completely different from either one alone. The old woman in the cardigan and the man in the black leather jacket, the silver ring on her hand that said "Ride Free," the way he'd been sitting at the end of the counter since before she arrived, with his back to the room, both hands around his mug, watching the reflections in the window glass. He had been watching from the moment he sat down. He had been there before her. He had not come to rescue her. He had come because she'd asked him to be there. George Tamboli felt something shift in his understanding of the morning, the way the meaning of a sentence shifts when you find out the last word. He looked at Ellie, who was straightening her bag on her shoulder and looking at absolutely no one, her expression, that of a woman who has checked something off a list and is moving to the next item. Derek Hollis looked at the man's jacket, at the patch on the chest, at the words and the insignia that had been there the whole time that Derek had registered, without fully processing, when the man was sitting at the counter that he was processing now, with the particular quality of attention that arrives too late. He said, with the last of the confidence available to him, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I've got lawyers and— I know you do, the man said. He reached up and adjusted the collar of his jacket, the small gesture of a person settling into a conversation they've prepared for. I spent 11 years in the United States Army, military police. After that, 8 years doing security and contract work in commercial construction and real estate development. He let that sit for a moment. I know what a purchase agreement looks like. I know what an assignment of lease looks like. And I know that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a contract signed within a narrow window, following a bereavement when one party is grieving, financially unsophisticated, and subject to external pressure regarding alleged existing obligations, can be challenged under the doctrine of undue influence, depending on the facts. He said it like a man reading from a document he has memorized, not performing, not threatening, stating. And I know, he continued, that what you just did to my mother in front of everyone in this room is assault, simple assault, Class 2 misdemeanor in this state, which becomes more interesting if the victim is over 65, which she is. Derek's mouth was open. He closed it. Craig Beaumont took 2 more steps backward and found himself standing against the far wall. Nate had quietly put on his jacket. Donna Reese at her corner table had not moved. Her phone was still on the table beside the book. The book was closed. She was looking at the phone with the careful attention of someone monitoring a process that requires monitoring. It was George who moved next. He did it slowly. His knees protested the way they always did when he stood up from a seated position for more than 20 minutes, the particular complaint of joints that have been through 34 Pennsylvania winters and several thousand 12-hour shifts on a steel mill floor and have opinions about being asked to mobilize quickly. He straightened to his full height, 5'11", in the boots he always wore, which added almost an inch, and he walked the 8 steps from his table to the space near where Derek Hollis was standing, and he stopped. He looked at Derek. I've been coming to this diner, George said, since Hal's father ran it. His voice had the quality of a man who doesn't talk much, but when he does, the words have been sitting in him long enough that they come out fully formed. He was not angry exactly. Or maybe he was, but the anger was so old and so processed that it had become something more fundamental, the simple refusal at 67 to pretend that something is acceptable when it isn't. I was sitting right over there, he said, with a nod toward his table and the newspaper that was still spread across it, when that man took her sugar and made a smart remark about her age. And I didn't say anything. He said it plainly, not as confession, not as performance, just as fact. I didn't say anything when he threatened Hal. I kept reading my paper. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands that had made steel for 34 years, that were 70% scar tissue on the palms from 34 years of doing what was asked, that were slightly arthritic now, and trembled sometimes in the morning until they warmed up. He looked back up. I'm done reading my paper. He reached into the pocket of his work pants, the worn canvas ones that his daughter kept telling him to replace, and that he kept not replacing, and took out his phone. It was an older model with a case his grandson had picked out for him, dark blue, with small stars on it, which George considered undignified, but wore anyway because his grandson had been so pleased with the choice. My son Patrick is a lawyer, George said. Real estate, been practicing 12 years in Pittsburgh. He was already dialing. He's going to want to hear about this morning. Derek Hollis looked at the phone. He looked at George. He looked at the man in the black jacket. He looked at Ellie Mack, who was standing with her bag on her shoulder and her glasses back in place and her hands completely still at her sides, looking at him with an expression that was not triumph and not satisfaction and not any of the things that faces usually do when a situation resolves in their favor. She looked at him the way you look at something when you have been expecting it for a long time and it has finally arrived exactly as anticipated. It was Donna who spoke next. She did it without standing up, without raising her voice, without any of the performative qualities that such a moment might seem to invite. She simply addressed the room, addressed it the way a teacher addresses a room, which is to say with the assumption that what she's saying matters and that the people she's saying it to are capable of understanding why. I've been sitting in that corner, she said, since 8:15 this morning. She picked up her phone. She turned it so that the screen faced the room. I have 11 minutes of video from the moment this gentleman first raised his voice to Hal. The room was very still. I taught 8th grade for 29 years, she said. I've seen a lot of people behave badly and then try to make the people they behave badly toward feel responsible for it. She set the phone back down on the table. I'm a retired school teacher. I've got nowhere to be today and I'm happy to wait here as long as it takes. Derek Hollis stared at her, at the phone, at the unremarkable woman in the brick-colored cardigan who had been sitting in the corner reading a paperback since before he arrived and whom he had not once in the course of the entire morning looked at directly. He turned to Craig. Craig had nothing. His face was the face of a man who has been operating for 15 years on the assumption that other people's confidence would cover for his own absence of it and who is now discovering in the least convenient moment possible that confidence is not transferable. It was at this point, this particular point after Donna had spoken, and George was on the phone and Craig had retreated to the wall and Nate had physically removed himself from the building, a fact that nobody noticed until later that the sound came from outside. A car, 2 of them. The particular sound of vehicles that know where they're going and are going there directly. Maya had moved to the window. She looked out at Ridgeway Avenue and said in the voice of someone reporting a fact rather than editorializing about it, police. Derek Hollis looked at the door. Officer Lynn Tran and Officer David Briggs came through it with the practiced ease of people who have been trained to enter a room and assess it in the first 4 seconds. Tran was 34 compact with the alert economy of movement of someone who has been doing this long enough that her body has internalized the protocols. Briggs was older, mid-40s, broader with the particular wariness of someone who has seen enough of what human beings do to each other that almost nothing surprises him anymore, but who has also, for exactly that reason, a very low tolerance for the particular category of behavior that was written all over the atmosphere of Keller's Diner on this Tuesday morning. They looked at the room. They took in the tableau, the large man in the black jacket, the older woman with the displaced glasses and the careful posture, the well-dressed man with the expensive watch standing slightly off-center in the way of someone who has recently lost their position in a space and not yet found another, the man against the wall, the woman with the phone in the corner, the old man with the blue-starred phone case who was already talking to someone. Briggs looked at Derek. Derek straightened. He exhaled. He said, "Officer, thank you for responding. There's a situation here that—" "We received a call," Tran said, from Eleanor Mack. Derek stopped. "The call came in at 9:22, Tran continued, reporting a situation at this address that was escalating and requested a unit respond. 9:22. The room understood this at different speeds. Maya understood it first because she was young and quick and had been paying close attention to everything that had happened this morning. George understood it a few seconds later, and his hand, the one not holding the phone, went to his mouth briefly in the expression of a man recalibrating something significant. Hal in the kitchen doorway looked at Ellie with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. 9:22 was before Derek had moved toward Ellie. 9:22 was before he'd grabbed her hair. 9:22 was in fact approximately 90 seconds after Derek had told Hal, in front of a full dining room, that the building had been sold and the lease would not be renewed. Ellie had called the police from her pocket, the phone she'd taken out and looked at and returned to her cardigan while the room was watching Derek and Hal, while George was looking at his newspaper, while Derek was already certain that the morning was entirely his. She had called them, described the situation, given the name, given the address, and then she had put her phone away and finished her toast. She had known he would go further. She had known because she had done what she always did, which was to pay attention to the pattern of his voice when he spoke to Maya, to the particular quality of his entitlement, which was not the entitlement of a man who stops when he's met resistance, but the entitlement of a man who escalates. And she had made a calculation that was based not on hope or assumption, but on 35 years of precision work and 72 years of understanding how things unfold when certain conditions are present. She had been right. Officer Tran was looking at Ellie now. "Ma'am, are you Eleanor Mack?" Ellie said she was. "Can you describe what happened after you placed the call?" Ellie described it. She did it with the same level unhurried precision she brought to everything the approach, the proximity, the grabbing. She described it in the language of sequence and fact without decoration, the way a woman who spent 3.5 decades ensuring that the exact details were exactly right describes something that happened to her. She pointed out that there were approximately 20 people present who had observed the same sequence of events, that one of them had recorded it from the beginning, and that her son, who was present as well, had been standing at the far end of the counter and had a clear line of sight to the entire incident. Tran looked at Raymond. Raymond said, "Raymond Mack, I'm her son. I was at the counter from 8:30. I saw everything from the first incident." The first incident being, "When the man over there," Raymond said, with a slight tilt of his head toward Craig against the wall, "took my mother's sugar without asking and made a remark about her age. That was the beginning." Tran wrote something down. Derek Hollis had his phone out. He was texting with the focused energy of a man who is trying to transfer the problem to a professional who handles problems. His lawyer, almost certainly his lawyer. Briggs walked over to him. Not quickly. The walk of a man who has all the time in the world, which is the walk you adopt when you want the other person to understand that the timeline is no longer theirs. They talked in low voices near the far end of the room, near the table that was still covered with Derek's papers and folders and the 2 phones and the remains of the coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Ellie sat down, not because she was tired necessarily, but because standing had served its purpose and sitting was what one did. She sat at her original table, the foretop near the door, not the window table, because the window table still had a coffee cup on it that nobody had cleared, and she was not the kind of woman who made a point of reclaiming things symbolically. She sat where she had been sitting. She folded her hands. Raymond came to the table and sat across from her. They did not speak immediately. There was a quality to their silence that was not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who know each other well enough that silence is not a gap requiring filling, but simply another form of the same conversation. Then Raymond said quietly, "You knew he was going to put his hands on you." Ellie considered this for a moment. She had the thoughtful pause of someone who does not answer questions faster than she's thought about them. "I knew he was the kind of person who would," she said. "Whether he did on this particular morning depended on variables I couldn't fully control, but I thought he probably would." Raymond was looking at the table. His jaw worked slightly, the slight movement of a man processing something that his body finds more difficult to manage than his mind does, which is the asymmetry that comes from caring about someone enough that what happens to them lands in your body first. "You could have not come," he said. "I know. You could have let Patrick handle the legal piece and stayed home. I know that too." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of a mother who loves her son enough to be completely honest with him and has been doing it for 48 years and sees no reason to stop. "Jimmy Franklin called me on a Friday," she said. "He was crying. He'd just gotten out of a meeting with a man who told him his father had left financial obligations that Jimmy was now responsible for, and that the right thing, the responsible thing, the thing that honored his father, was to sign the agreement and close the chapter. Jimmy is 26 years old. His father died 6 weeks ago. He signed because he didn't know he didn't have to." She looked at her hands. "I wanted to look at the man who did that. I wanted him to know I knew." Raymond said nothing for a moment. "Then and the rest of it." "The rest of it," Ellie agreed, "I left up to him." This was the thing about Ellie Mack, that the people who knew her understood, and the people who didn't know her didn't. She was not a person who believed in forcing outcomes. She was a person who believed in creating conditions, in setting up the fabric correctly, in getting the seam pinned right, in making sure that when pressure was applied, it would fall exactly where it was supposed to. The cutting, the shaping, the final form, those things emerged from the preparation. You did the preparation correctly and you trusted the rest. She had done the preparation. She'd contacted Donna 3 days ago. Donna, who she knew from the neighborhood association, who she knew was someone with patience and a phone and the kind of conviction about right and wrong that comes from 29 years of explaining consequences to 14-year-olds. She told Donna what she knew and what she expected and what she needed from her. Donna had said what time. She called Raymond Sunday night and told him where to be and when and why. And she'd been very specific. You're there as a witness, not as an intervention. You let it run, you let it be what it is, unless it requires you to be something else, in which case you'll know. He had been there at 8:30. He had ordered coffee. He had sat with his back to the room because there was a window above the counter, and in the reflection of the gray Pittsburgh morning, he could see every table, every person, every cup and plate, and newspaper and phone. He had watched. He had waited. He had known from the moment Derek Hollis walked in that the morning was going to go the way his mother said it would. He had known it from the voice, from the posture, from the particular way Derek moved through a room as though the room existed to accommodate him. He had seen that before. 11 years of military police work, 8 years of construction, security, and 48 years of being a human being in the world had given him a catalog of types, and Derek Hollis was a type, and the type did not surprise him. What had surprised him, or not surprised him exactly, but moved him in the way that certain things still moved him, despite the catalog. Despite the years, was watching his mother sit at her table and eat her toast, watching her lift her coffee cup with the hands that he had known his whole life, the hands with the vein on the back of the right one that stood out when she gripped things, the hands with the calluses at the thumb joints from 35 years of the needle and the thimble. Watching her look at Derek Hollis with the complete attention of someone who was simply gathering information, recording it, holding it in the careful archive of herself that she'd been building for 72 years. He had known exactly how it would go. He had been angry anyway. Both things were true, and he had let both of them be true, and he had sat at the counter and he had waited. Officer Tran came over to the table. She pulled out a chair. The chair George had been sitting in, George, who was now across the room talking to his son on the phone with the focused quiet of a man being methodical, and she sat down across from Ellie and Raymond with the notepad open. She asked Ellie to describe from the beginning the history of her knowledge of Derek Hollis. She asked in the way that good officers ask, not leading, not confirming, just open, just tell me, Ellie told her. She told her about Robert Franklin, who had been her neighbor for 40 years, who had taught her son to change a tire in 1991 in the driveway between their two houses, who had brought food to her door for 3 weeks after Frank died because he understood that grief and cooking do not coexist well, and he was the kind of person who understood things like that. She told her about Robert's death, the heart attack the Wednesday night, the ordinary, terrible suddenness of it. She told her about Jimmy's call 5 weeks later and what Jimmy had said and what she had recognized in what Jimmy said, the specific shape of a pressure sale, the contours of a story told to someone vulnerable at a moment of maximum vulnerability, designed to produce a signature before the person could think clearly enough to ask whether they needed to sign at all. She told Tran about the lease. She had asked Hal 2 Tuesdays ago to let her look at his original lease agreement. Hal had brought it to her in a manila envelope that he'd kept in the filing cabinet in the office behind the kitchen for 23 years. She'd read it at this table with her coffee in 40 minutes. She'd found the renewal clause on page 7, the right of first refusal for the tenant upon an expiration of the current term, which meant that before the building could be offered to any new tenant or the lease allowed to lapse, Hal had to be given the opportunity to renew on the same terms. It meant that Derek Hollis, who had purchased the building without notifying Hal, and had been representing to Hal and to the room this morning that the lease's end was a fait accompli, had in fact purchased a building with an encumbrance he either didn't know about or had chosen not to mention. She had shown the clause to Raymond. Raymond had confirmed what she thought it meant. She had not told Hal yet because she had wanted to be sure and because she had wanted the sequence to unfold in the order she'd planned. Officer Tran was writing steadily. At the far end of the room, Briggs was still talking to Derek, or rather Derek was talking to his phone, and Briggs was waiting for him to finish with the infinite patience of a man who has learned that waiting is sometimes the most effective intervention. Craig Beaumont had at some point in the last 15 minutes ceased to be against the wall and become simply absent. Nobody had seen him leave. He had simply at some point stopped being there in the way that certain presences dissolve when the situation they were attached to dissolves. The tray of papers and folders on the corner table sat exactly where it had been. The laptop was still open, its screen gone dark from inactivity. The two phones, both face up as they had been all morning, sat on either side of the laptop like a statement about priorities. Maya had brought out coffee. She'd brought it to the table where Ellie and Raymond were sitting without being asked the way she brought Ellie her coffee every Tuesday, because some things don't change because of what happened around them. She'd set the cups down without speaking, and then gone back to the counter because there were still other people in the diner and they still needed things. And the work of taking care of people who needed things didn't stop because the room had had a difficult morning. George came over when he was done with his phone. He moved differently than he had when he'd stood up from his table. The mechanical difficulty of his joints had not changed the knees. Still complained the right shoulder. Still had the particular stiffness it had developed in his fourth decade at the mill and never fully surrendered. But there was something in his posture that had shifted, something in the quality of his movement that was more settled, more deliberate, more like a man who knows why he's moving. And not just that, He sat down. There were enough chairs at the foretop, and he took one. He looked at Ellie. She looked at him. He said, Patrick knows the Hollis Property Group. He said there have been questions about the way they operate, about the pattern. Ellie said nothing. He wants to know everything from this morning. He's driving in. George put his phone on the table face down. He said if the purchase agreement was signed inside the period following the bereavement, and if there was misrepresentation involved in the inducement to sign the whole thing, is potentially voidable. He said it carefully, the way a man who doesn't use legal language repeats legal language he has just been given with the slight formality of someone handling something unfamiliar. He used a word, undue influence. Raymond said, that's the right word. George looked at him. You know this area. Some of it, enough to know what to look for. George was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands on the table. Then he said, I should have said something earlier, when that other one took her sugar. Ellie looked at him. Her expression was not absolution exactly. It was something more honest than absolution, which is what you offer someone when they don't quite deserve it yet, and something more useful. It was the expression of a woman who has thought clearly about the question of what people owe each other in moments like this one, and has arrived at a view. You stood up, she said, when it mattered. George looked at the table. I've been retired 6 years, he said. I keep thinking, what am I still good for? What's left that I can actually... He stopped himself. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, and he'd already said more in the last hour than he usually managed in a week. You called your son, Ellie said, and your son is going to make sure that what happened to Jimmy Franklin doesn't happen to anyone else. That's not nothing. George picked up his coffee. He held it with both hands the way he always held his coffee because his hands were always slightly cold. It was Maya who said from behind the counter in the quiet that had followed, he's coming out. Briggs was walking back toward the center of the room. Derek Hollis was behind him, moving with the specific gait of a man who has been asked to do something he does not want to do, and is doing it in the way that makes clear he does not consider the asking legitimate. He had his jacket over his arm. He did not have his papers, which were still spread across the corner table. He did not have his laptop, which was still open and dark. He passed the table where Ellie and Raymond and George were sitting. He slowed. He looked at Ellie. And for a moment in the expression that crossed his face, not regret, or not only regret, but the particular expression of a man who is calculating something and finding that the numbers don't work the way they used to work, that the variables he's been using to run this equation have turned out to be wrong, there was something almost like recognition. Of what exactly, it was hard to say. Of the morning, maybe. Of the woman in the cardigan who had known his name before she sat down, who had called the police before he'd done anything that warranted them, who had read Hal's lease 2 Tuesdays ago and sat with this knowledge through her coffee and her toast, while he spread his papers across the room and told the people in it that their years here were done. Ellie looked at him. Her voice when she spoke was the same voice she'd used all morning, the level, unhurried voice of someone for whom drama is a waste of precision. Jimmy Franklin deserved to grieve his father in peace, she said. That's all I came here to say. Derek Hollis stood there for a moment. Then Briggs touched his elbow lightly, the guidance rather than the force, and Derek Hollis walked toward the door and out of it into the Pittsburgh morning, where his car was parked at the meter he'd fed before coming in, and the world was for the moment still operating on its usual schedule, still moving in the ordinary way of things, though the ordinary way of things was already beginning to look, from certain angles, considerably less hospitable than it had at 9 o'clock this morning. The bell above the door rang its 2-note chime. The door closed. The room breathed. The bell above the door was still vibrating when the room came back to itself. It happened the way rooms come back after something has passed through them. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but gradually in the small, sequential movements of people who have been holding themselves in place and are now carefully releasing. A chair shifted. Someone exhaled. Dennis in the kitchen began moving again, the sound of the flat iron against the grill, the familiar rhythm of a man who had stopped what he was doing and was now picking it back up because the work was still there, and the work didn't care what had just happened in the dining room. Maya moved first the way she always moved, which was toward whatever needed doing. She picked up the coffee carafe and went around to the tables where cups had gone cold and people had stopped noticing them, and she refilled without asking, because refilling without asking was one of the things she was good at, and she had decided sometime in the last hour that she was going to be very good at the things she was good at and not let this morning take that from her. The family with the small children, the 3-year-old with the stuffed dog, had been very quiet through all of it. The boy had eaten his eggs and his half a piece of toast and was now engaged in walking his stuffed dog along the edge of the table in a purposeful way that suggested the dog had places to be. The girl had watched the whole morning with the particular attention of a 5-year-old who understands that something significant is happening without being able to name it. She looked at her mother, who looked back at her, and something passed between them in the way things pass between parents and children who know each other well enough to communicate without words. The older woman with the crossword puzzle at the back table had put her pen down at some point during the confrontation and had not picked it back up. She was looking at the table with the crossword on it, but she was not looking at the crossword. She was looking at the place on the table where the crossword happened to be while she thought about something else. After a while, she picked the pen back up and filled in a word she had apparently worked out during the interval. Outside on Ridgeway Avenue, normal Tuesday continued. Cars passed. The bus came to the stop across the street, and 2 people got off, and 1 person got on, and it pulled away. A woman walked by with a stroller that was not the same stroller that was inside the diner. A different stroller belonging to a different morning and a different set of concerns entirely. The pigeons that Ellie had noticed earlier were still at their work on the sidewalk, still deeply invested in whatever dispute had claimed their attention, the world's smallest ongoing argument conducted with absolute conviction. Officer Tran was still at the foretop, still writing. She had filled several pages of her notepad. She was methodical in the way of someone who understands that the value of a document is in its completeness, that the detail which seems minor at the time of recording is frequently the detail that matters later, that the work of getting it right is done now, not when you need it. She had taken statements from Maya, from George, from Donna, who had walked her phone over to the table and shown her the video, all 11 minutes and 23 seconds of it, the timestamp running in the corner, in the small digital numbers, that will in the coming weeks become the most important 11 minutes and 23 seconds that Derek Hollis wishes had never existed. Tran had watched without expression the way trained observers watch things, cataloging rather than reacting. And at the end, she had asked Donna if she would be willing to provide a formal copy of the recording, and Donna had said she had been waiting to be asked. Raymond had given his statement standing up near the counter. He spoke in the same register he'd used throughout the morning, low, factual, precise, and Tran wrote what he said with the same attention she'd given everything else. When he was done, she asked if he had any questions, and he said no. And then he went back to the table where his mother was sitting, and he sat down across from her, and they both held their coffee cups and didn't speak for a while. Outside through the front window, Ellie could see Briggs near the patrol car talking to Derek Hollis. Derek had his phone pressed to his ear and was talking to it with the intensity of a man who has transferred all of his energy into the device because the situation immediately around him is no longer one he can manage. His lawyer, presumably. Or someone who was going to tell him what to do next, which amounted to the same thing. Ellie watched him for a moment. She felt she would say later if anyone asked, and she expected no one would, which was fine. Not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a thing done correctly. The feeling of a seam that lay flat and even, that did what it was supposed to do, that held the weight it was designed to hold. She had spent her career understanding that feeling, had spent 35 years learning to recognize it and trust it and not mistake it for something more or less than what it was. She picked up her coffee. It was still warm. The collapse of Derek Hollis that Tuesday did not happen in one dramatic moment. It rarely does for people like Derek Hollis. People who have built their position on a series of interlocking things, relationships, contracts, reputations, that can only be dismantled in the order they were built. It happened in layers, like a wall coming down section by section, each piece making the next piece easier. The first layer was the immediate one. Officer Briggs, having spoken with Derek for 20 minutes in the manner of a man who has long since stopped being interested in whether the person he's speaking with considered their conversation fair, walked back into the diner and told Officer Tran that a formal report had been filed. Simple assault section 2701 of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code, complainant Eleanor Mack. Given the video evidence and the number of corroborating witnesses, Briggs said not to Tran exactly, but to the general air of the room, in the way that certain things get said when the room needs to hear them, the disposition of that report would not be complicated. Derek Hollis was not arrested that morning. He was issued a citation and informed in the specific language the law uses when it wants to be unmistakably clear of the next steps and the timeline that attach to them. He was told not to leave the county without notifying the department. He was told that the formal charging process would proceed based on the evidence gathered. He walked back to his car. He sat in it for 11 minutes, visible through the diner window, not moving. Then he drove away. The second layer was the one George's son Patrick was already working on before Derek's car had turned off Ridgeway Avenue. Patrick Tamboli was 41 years old and had been practicing real estate law in Pittsburgh for 12 years, with the specific focus of someone who went into the field. Not because it was lucrative, though it was usually, but because he had grown up watching what happened to working people when they encountered the law in the form of contracts they didn't fully understand, and he had decided that he would rather be on the side of the understanding than the side of the obscuring. He drove a practical car and wore practical suits and asked questions until he had the answers he actually needed, which had made him over 12 years very good at his job. He knew the name Hollis Property Group. He had known it for 8 months when a woman from Allegheny County had come to his office with a purchase agreement she'd signed 3 weeks after her mother's death, convinced that she'd been told the property was subject to a reverse mortgage obligation that didn't actually exist. The agreement had been voided eventually after considerable work and considerable time that the woman didn't have, and Patrick had given her anyway on a fee structure that his business partner occasionally raised an eyebrow about. The company name was the same, the method was the same, the alleged obligation, the urgency, the window of maximum vulnerability. When George had called him and described the morning at Keller's, Patrick had sat down at his desk and opened a file he had not looked at in the 6 months. Then he'd opened 2 other files. Then he'd called a colleague who practiced in Westmoreland County and asked a question and listened to the answer for a long time. He was in his car within 20 minutes of George's call. He would arrive at Keller's at 11:40 with a notepad and the particular focused energy of a lawyer who has just connected a pattern that has been existing in separate files and now exists in one place, which is the moment when a collection of problems becomes something else, something with a shape and a direction and potentially an outcome. The third layer was Donna. Donna Reese had been a teacher for 29 years, which meant she had spent 29 years figuring out how to put things where people could see them. She was good at it in the way that people who have done something for 3 decades are good at it, not thinking about the how, just doing it, the method, having long since dissolved into instinct. She posted the video to the neighborhood community group at 10:47 that morning with a brief description of what had happened that was specific without being inflammatory, factual without being cold, and written with the clarity of someone who understands that the thing itself is the argument and the thing itself does not require embellishment. By noon, 4,000 people had seen it. By 3 that afternoon, the number was closer to 18,000 because it had been shared into 3 adjacent community groups and a local news page in a general Pittsburgh neighborhood forum where someone had written simply in the comment section, "This is Keller's on Ridgeway." Most of us know this place. Most of us know how. A local television news producer saw it at 4:15. She called the station's general assignment desk. The assignment editor looked at the video and looked at the timestamp and looked at the story, the diner, the lease, the old woman, the son, and made a decision that took approximately 45 seconds. None of that had happened yet when Ellie and Raymond were sitting at the foretop and Hal came out of the kitchen. He had been back there for the last 40 minutes since Briggs had walked Derek outside. He'd gone back to work the coffee, the orders that were still coming in, the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning that had decided despite everything to continue, and Dennis had cooked and Maya had served, and the diner had done what it did, which was feed people and exist and not stop existing just because something difficult had happened. But Hal had been thinking, you could do both in a kitchen. You could do both anywhere if you'd been doing it long enough. He came out now without his apron. He'd taken it off and left it on the hook inside the kitchen, which was something he did only when he considered himself to be not working, which was rare. He pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down at the foretop without asking, because this was his place, and he'd been sitting where he needed to sit for 31 years, and he wasn't going to be formal about it now. He looked at Raymond. Raymond said without preamble, "Your original lease, you still have it." Hal said he had it. He'd gone and gotten it from the filing cabinet in the office while he was in the back because he'd remembered somewhere in the last 40 minutes that Ellie had asked to look at it 2 weeks ago and had returned it with a look on her face that he hadn't quite been able to read at the time, but was reading differently now. He put the manila envelope on the table. Raymond opened it. He went to page 7 without looking for it, which told Hal something. He read the relevant clause the way a man reads something he's read before quickly confirming, not discovering. He set the document down flat on the table. Right of first refusal, he said. Renewal terms. Before the building can be offered to any new tenant or the lease allowed to lapse, you have to be given the opportunity to renew at the same rate for an equivalent term. Hal looked at the document. Hollis bought this building without notifying you, Raymond said. That's a breach of the existing lease terms. The purchase itself may still stand. That's between him and the Franklin estate, but his ability to refuse your renewal is constrained by this clause regardless of the sale. Hal read the clause. He read it a second time. He read it the way a man reads something that is going to require him to adjust the story he has been telling himself about a situation, which is always a slower process than reading it the first time. He set the document down. He looked at Ellie. She was looking at the window, at Ridgeway Avenue, at the ordinary Tuesday continuing outside the glass. He said, "You read this 2 weeks ago." She said, "I read it." He said, "And you didn't tell me." She looked at him then, the look of a woman being fair. "I told you I wanted to look at it. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I told you anything. I didn't want to give you information that turned out to be wrong." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer." "But Raymond confirmed what I thought it meant last week." Hal was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the document. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a man who has been handling hot plates and sheet pans and heavy equipment since he was 16 years old, hands that showed every year of it. 31 years, he said, not to anyone specifically, just to the air. "I know," Ellie said. "My father opened this place in 71. I've been here since 88. He stopped. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was not going to cry now, but there was something in his face that was doing the work that tears would do in a different kind of man, something settling, some shift in the way he was holding himself that had been held a particular way since the moment Derek Hollis had said the words building and March and not renewing, and was now fractionally beginning to release. "Patrick will want to talk to you," Raymond said. "George's son, he's coming in. He'll go through the lease in detail and tell you what your options are. But what you're looking at minimum is a strong argument that the new owner is bound by the existing renewal clause, that he can't just walk in and terminate you." Hal nodded slowly. He looked at Ellie one more time. She was looking at the table now, at the edge of the napkin she'd been straightening earlier, the one that didn't need straightening. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" And Ellie said, "Because I wanted you to know what you had, not just be told. There's a difference." Hal didn't answer right away. He sat with it for a moment, the distinction she was drawing, which was the distinction between information given and understanding earned, and he recognized in it the same thing he'd always recognized in Ellie Mack when he bothered to pay attention, which was that she thought about things more carefully than most people did and said less about it than most people would. He picked up the lease and put it back in the envelope. He stood up. He looked at the room, the tables, the photographs, the counter with its 8 stools, the kitchen where Dennis was still cooking, the window, where the morning light came in on the left side exactly as it always did. He went back to work. George came back to the table at some point. It was getting toward 11. The morning rush, having long since become the slow drift toward lunch, and he sat down again across from Ellie with the air of a man who has done what he came to do and is still sitting with the experience of having done it. The room was quieter now. Most of the morning regulars had gone. The family with the stroller had left when Briggs and Tran departed. The postal worker had finished his eggs and his whole wheat toast and his coffee and left his usual tip and gone back to his route, which had been waiting for him with the patience of a route which has no patience at all. The woman with the crossword had eventually solved or abandoned several clues and folded the paper and gone, pausing at the counter to say something quiet to Hal that made him nod. Donna Reese was still there. She had ordered a second cup of coffee and another bran muffin, which she'd been eating at intervals, and she had gone back to her book, or appeared to go back to her book, which was what Donna did when she needed to appear to be doing something while actually doing something else. A skill she had developed over 29 years of managing 38th graders simultaneously. She had been watching the room the way she always watched a room, taking notes in the internal way, the way teachers take notes on what was happening between people, on what was being said and not said, on the texture of the aftermath of a difficult thing. She looked up when George sat down. She looked at Ellie. She looked at Raymond. She said, "I'm going to post the video." Ellie looked at her. "Not to be sensational," Donna said, "because people should know that this happens, and because the more people who see it, the harder it is to make it go away quietly." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Do you want me to?" "All right, Donna." Donna nodded. She picked up her phone. George was looking at the table. He'd been looking at the table since he sat down with the focused non-attention of a man who is actually looking at something else entirely, something interior, something he's been carrying around long enough that its weight is familiar but no less heavy for the familiarity. He said, "Can I ask you something?" Ellie said he could. "How'd you know to do all this?" The whole... He moved his hand in a gesture that encompassed the room the morning the sequence of events that had ended with Derek Hollis in the front seat of his car not moving for 11 minutes. "How do you know to put it together like that? To think about it that way?" Ellie considered this in the way she considered things, which was to say genuinely not performing the consideration, but actually doing it, taking the question seriously enough to give it a real answer. "I used to make things," she said, 35 years, wedding dresses, suit jackets, hems alterations. Things that had to fit. Things that if they didn't fit exactly didn't work, didn't look right, didn't hold together." She looked at her hands. "You learn to see a whole thing before you cut it. You learn to plan every step before you make the first one. Because once you cut the fabric, you can't uncut it." George looked at her hands. He looked at the calluses, the joints, the slight unevenness in the right thumb where she'd had a bad sewing accident in her second year, and the bone had healed slightly off angle in the way that old injuries do. "I'm not that smart," he said. "I'm just being honest. I'm not the kind of person who thinks that many steps ahead." Ellie shook her head. "You stood up." "I almost didn't." "I know." If he hadn't, George stopped. If he'd just talked to her differently. Been less, he stopped again. "I would have read my paper. I would have gone home." Ellie didn't dispute this. "You've been sitting in this diner for how many years?" she said. George thought about it. 8, since Marion died, mornings mostly, sometimes lunch. 8 years. "And you've seen things in here that needed saying and you didn't say them." He said yes. "And today you did." He said yes. "What changed?" George was quiet for a long time. Long enough that it was clear he wasn't just waiting to answer, but actually going through the question, actually moving through it the way you move through a space you've been avoiding for a long time and finding it both smaller and larger than you remembered. He said he put his hands on her. He said it simply the way simple things are said when they're genuinely simple, when the answer doesn't need decoration or qualification, when it is what it is and the what it is sufficient. "A man put his hands on an old woman in this diner," he said, "and I was sitting 10 feet away. And I thought, what am I doing? What have I been doing? Reading my paper, drinking my coffee, staying out of it." He looked up. "Marion would have..." He stopped. "What would Marion have done?" Ellie asked. George almost smiled. "She would have been standing up before the first remark about the sugar. She wouldn't have waited for any of the rest of it." "What did Marion do?" "She was a nurse. 32 years. I see you." He paused. "She was never afraid of anybody. She'd walk into a room where someone was being an idiot and say what needed saying and walk out, and that was the end of it." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I always let her do the hard parts." Ellie looked at him. "The hard parts are still there," she said. "You just have to do them yourself now." It was a simple thing to say, and she said it simply without kindness, performed as softness, because Ellie Mack had known enough grief to know that the kindest thing you can do for someone living inside it is to not insult them by making things lighter than they are. George was 67 years old and his wife was dead, and he had been sitting in this diner for 8 years doing the comfortable and slightly diminished version of living that grief sometimes produces in people who love the person they lost more than they love the ease of moving on. Ellie knew this. She had done her own version of it. She also knew that the version was not permanent unless you let it be. George said nothing for a while. He held his cup. The coffee had gone cold again. Then he said, "Thank you." Ellie said, "You did the work. Thank you is for the work." Patrick arrived at 11:40. He was taller than his father with George's jaw and his mother's eyes, in the specific kind of efficient energy that belongs to lawyers who are good at what they do and know it without being smug about it. He came in with a briefcase and a laptop bag and stopped at the counter first to shake Hal's hand, which told Ellie something about who he was, and then he came to the table and introduced himself and sat down. He and Raymond talked for 40 minutes. Ellie listened. George listened. Hal came out and sat down again with his manila envelope, and Patrick read the lease with the attention of someone who was confirming rather than discovering, and asked 2 or 3 specific questions and then set the document down. He said the renewal clause is clear. The breach is arguable, and I think a strong argument. I'd want to pull the title transfer documents to see exactly how it was structured and whether there was any disclosure at the time of sale, but based on what you're describing, Hal, I think you have a real case here. Then he asked Raymond about the Jimmy Franklin situation, about the alleged obligation and the 5-day window after the bereavement. Raymond told him what he knew. Ellie filled in what she knew. Patrick wrote steadily. He said, "The Franklin matter is separate but related. If the pattern holds, and based on what I'm already aware of, I believe it does, there may be grounds for a broader inquiry. That's not something I can commit to today, but it's something I'm going to look into. He paused. The immediate thing, he said, is that Jimmy Franklin should not have signed and the signing may be voidable, and he should have someone looking at that for him. Does he have a lawyer? Ellie said, he has an appointment on Wednesday with the Legal Aid Society. I set it up for him last week. Patrick looked at her for a moment. He said, okay, that's good. That's the right place to start. Raymond said to Patrick, give us a contact. Someone at Legal Aid who knows real estate. I'll make sure Jimmy's appointment is with the right person. Patrick said he knew someone. He would make a call. They left the table to the lawyers. Ellie sat back in her chair. Outside, the Tuesday was getting on toward noon. The light had changed. The sharp morning angle of it had softened into the flatter, more even light of the middle of the day, and Ridgeway Avenue had the look of a street that is between its morning purpose and its afternoon purpose, the lull that belongs to neither. Maya came over. She had her carafe, which she seemed to carry the way some people carry worry, not as an intention but as a habit, something to do with the hands when the hands need something to do. She refilled Ellie's cup. She refilled Raymond's. She stood at the edge of the table for a moment holding the carafe, and Ellie looked at her. Maya looked like she wanted to say something and was working out how to say it. She had the expression of someone who has been carrying a feeling around through a long and difficult morning and has arrived at a moment that seems like the right moment to put it down. She said, can I ask you something? Ellie said she could. Maya looked at the ring on Ellie's right hand. She had looked at it many times over 3 years, always decided against asking, and now decided for asking, because the morning had shifted something about what was possible to say. The ring, she said, ride free. I've always wanted to know. Ellie looked at the ring. She turned it slightly on her finger the way she sometimes did an old habit. She looked at Raymond. He was looking at the ring too. He had the expression that comes over certain faces when they look at something they know very well, something that has been present through so much of their life that it has stopped being an object and become something more like a part of the landscape. Ellie said, the day Raymond was accepted into his chapter 27 years ago, he drove home, came to the door. She paused. He put this ring on the kitchen table. He said, I'll always come home, Mom. Wherever I am, I'll always come home. She looked at the ring. I put it on that day, she said. I haven't taken it off. Maya stood at the edge of the table with her carafe, and she did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would add to what had been said. Some things are complete as they are. Raymond was looking at the table. He had the expression of a man who is letting himself feel something he has spent years being disciplined about feeling, who has in the way of certain men managed his emotional life with the same efficiency he brought to everything else, and who is finding in this particular moment that the management system has temporarily suspended itself. He said without looking up, I was 15 minutes away when you texted. Ellie said, I know. I could have been there sooner. You were where I told you to be. I know, but Raymond. Her voice had the quality of a woman who has had this kind of conversation many times and loves the person she's having it with enough to be direct. You did what I asked. You let it run the way it needed to run, and then you were there. He was quiet. That's the whole thing, she said. That's all of it. He looked up at her. He had his father's eyes, or what she remembered of his father's eyes, which she had not had to go far to remember because she had been looking at the version of them that lived in her son for 48 years. Frank's eyes, brown, warm, direct, capable of saying things the rest of the face was keeping quiet. He said, I should have pushed back on you more about coming here. Probably. You knew I wouldn't. Probably. Raymond shook his head, the small, slow head shake of a man who has spent his whole life being unable to argue his mother into or out of anything, and has long since made peace with this as one of the fixed conditions of his existence. George across the table had the expression of someone watching something that is none of his business, and not looking away because it is one of the better things he has seen in some time, and he is too old to pretend that the better things don't matter. The afternoon came in slowly through the front window. Patrick stayed for another hour talking to Hal with his laptop open and his notepad beside it, and the focused industry of a lawyer who has found the thread he's been looking for and is not going to let go of it. George sat with him for a while, then moved back to his regular table with his newspaper, which he did not read, but which sat in front of him like an old companion that didn't require anything. Donna finished her second bran muffin and her second coffee and her book, which she closed and put in her bag with the satisfaction of a person who has completed a thing, and she came by the table on her way out. She stopped. She looked at Ellie. She said, it's at 4,000 shares. Ellie looked at her. The video, Donna said, 4,000 shares as of 10 minutes ago. The Channel 4 news desk called me. Ellie was quiet. Donna said, I told them where to find you if they want a statement. I didn't give them your number. Good. Donna put her hand on Ellie's shoulder for a moment, not long, not making anything of it, the brief contact of two women who understand each other and don't need to make a production of it. And then she picked up her bag and her book and walked out of Keller's into the Tuesday afternoon. The bell chimed its two notes. Ellie sat. Raymond sat. The corner table where Derek Hollis had spread his papers still had the papers on it. Nobody had touched them. The laptop was still open, still dark. The two phones were still face up. At some point, one of them had begun buzzing the silent vibration of an incoming call, the face-down phone shuddering against the table surface, which nobody had moved to answer because it was nobody's phone and nobody's call. Eventually, it stopped. Maya cleared the table. She did it without ceremony, stacking the papers into an approximate pile, closing the laptop, setting the phones on top of the pile, moving the cold coffee cups to her tray. She cleaned the table surface with the same cloth she used on every table and put a fresh setting on it for whoever sat there next because the table was a table and the morning was over and the table did not carry anything forward from one use to the next. That was the table's advantage over the people. At 12:30, Ellie picked up her bag. She did it the way she always did, the practiced motion of a woman whose particular bag has been on her particular shoulder for years, the settling of it that requires no thought. She stood up. Raymond stood up. He went to the counter and spoke to Hal. He asked what he owed for his coffee. Hal shook his head. He set both hands flat on the counter and looked at Raymond with the expression of a man who has decided something and is not going to revisit it. Raymond said, Hal. Hal said, don't. Raymond said, the coffee? The coffee, Hal said, is covered. Has been covered for the record since last October when your mother brought in a container of cookies at Christmas the second year she'd done it, and I told her she didn't have to do that. And she told me she'd do what she liked, and I told her if she was going to do what she liked, then so was I. He looked at Raymond. She knows. She doesn't agree. We've been having this argument for 14 months, and she hasn't won yet. Raymond turned and looked at Ellie. Ellie looked back at him with the expression of someone who is not going to apologize for knowing exactly how she wants to spend her money and what she considers a fair arrangement. Raymond looked at Hal. He said, she told me she pays every week. Hal said, she leaves money on the table. Maya gives it to the holiday fund for the kitchen staff. Raymond turned back to Ellie. She said, I'm not going to argue with Hal in his own restaurant. You've been arguing with him for 14 months. I've been making my position clear for 14 months. That's different. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. He looked at Hal with the expression of a man who has just understood something about his mother that he probably should have understood before, which is that she has been operating on her own terms in this diner for years, and the terms include giving where she wants to give and accepting where she chooses to accept and making those decisions herself, which is a form of independence that is its own kind of wealth. He reached across the counter and shook Hal's hand. Hal held it for a moment. He said, quiet 31 years. Raymond said, I know. Hal said, she didn't have to do any of this. Raymond said she had to. That's what she would tell you if you asked. She'd say she had to because Jimmy Franklin needed somebody, and because this is what neighbors do, and because nobody else was going to. He paused. She's been saying that kind of thing in my whole life. I'm 48 years old and I'm still trying to catch up to it. Hal said nothing. He nodded the nod of a man receiving something he is going to sit with for a long time. Outside, the Pittsburgh afternoon was full on. The light was flat and even, and the street was doing what streets do between morning and evening, moving people from one thing to the next with the indifferent efficiency of infrastructure that has no stake in what the people are going toward, only in moving them. The Harley was parked at the curb directly in front of the door. It was the largest thing on that section of the sidewalk, dark and substantial and quiet, waiting with the particular patience of machines that have been built to take you somewhere and are ready whenever you are. Ellie came out first. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the motorcycle the way she always looked at it, with the particular expression of a woman who has never quite made peace with it and never quite made war with it either, who has arrived over 27 years at a settled acceptance of the thing that is actually something closer to affection, though she would not use that word. She said, you parked right in front of the door again. Raymond said, there was a spot. It's the biggest vehicle on the block. It's a motorcycle, Mom. It's an event. He stood next to her, both of them looking at the bike. She said, next time park around the corner. It would be better. He said, there are no good spots around the corner. She said, there's a reason people don't park motorcycles this size directly in front of glass doors. He said, the reason is they haven't found the right spot. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the bike with the expression of a man who is enjoying this conversation considerably more than he is letting on. She said, you are impossible. He said, I learned from you. This was the second time he'd said it this morning. The first time she'd smiled. This time she looked at him for a moment, really looked at him the way she'd been looking at him his whole life, finding in his face the specific combination of things that was entirely his and no one else's. And she reached out and put her hand on his arm. Not a long gesture. 5 seconds, maybe 6. Raymond looked down at her hand, the silver ring on the fourth finger catching the afternoon light, the calluses, the slight crookedness of the right thumb. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a moment on the sidewalk in front of Keller's Diner on Ridgeway Avenue in the ordinary Pittsburgh afternoon while two pigeons conducted their ongoing dispute on the sidewalk nearby, and the bus went by on its route, and a child on a bicycle rode past with the absolute concentration of someone who has recently learned to ride and has not yet arrived at the ability to do it without full commitment. Then Ellie took her hand back. She adjusted her bag. She looked down the street toward where her Civic was parked, the 2009, with the 140,000 miles and the air conditioning that hadn't worked in 3 summers. She said, "I'll see you Sunday." Raymond said, "I'll be there." She said, "I'm making pot roast." He said, "I know." She started walking. He watched her go the particular walk of a small woman who has been walking exactly this way for 7 decades, who has developed over that time the specific efficiency of someone who knows where they're going and is going there without wasting anything. Not a step, not a motion, not a single unnecessary expenditure of whatever it is we spend when we move through the world. She did not look back. He watched her until she reached the Civic and opened the door and got in, and he watched the car pull out of the spot and signal the blinker going dutifully on and off, even though the street was clear in both directions, and turn left off Ridgeway Avenue and disappear. He stood there another moment. Then he turned and looked through the glass door of Keller's at the room inside at George, back at his table with his newspaper at Patrick's laptop open at the corner table at Maya, moving between customers with her carafe at Hal behind the counter, with his hands on the surface and his eyes on the middle distance that belongs to people thinking about things that are larger than the immediate moment. And at the window table on the left side of the room, the two-top that caught the morning light. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went back inside. He went to Hal at this counter, and he said what he needed to say. And Hal listened. He got back on the phone with someone from the chapter, a man named Curtis, who had for 6 years been doing the quiet work of connecting people in legal trouble with resources they didn't know existed, which was the kind of work that almost nobody knew the chapter did, and which they had never done for attention, only for the need. He gave Curtis the information about Jimmy Franklin and the legal aid appointment and the name Patrick had given him. He stayed for another hour. When he finally walked out, he stood on the sidewalk and pulled on his jacket and took his helmet from the rack on the back of the bike. He clipped it. He swung his leg over. He started the engine. The Harley came to life with the sound that has no equivalent in the mechanical world, the particular thunder of a machine that is also somehow a statement, the deep rolling sound of it filling the block for a moment before settling into its idle waiting. He pulled out from the curb. He rode down Ridgeway Avenue in the afternoon light, past the bus stop and the pigeons, and the block of modest storefronts and the lives that move through them on an ordinary Tuesday, and he turned at the intersection and was gone. Inside Keller's Diner, Hal walked out from behind the counter with something in his hand. It was a small rectangular sign, the kind that sits in a folded metal holder on a restaurant table. Plastic white, the kind that usually says reserved in black letters, the kind that has been in the supply drawer behind the counter for years. Because occasionally a party calls ahead, and Hal sets a table and puts out the sign, and then the party arrives and he puts the sign back and it goes back in the drawer. He walked to the two-top by the front window on the left side of the room, the one with the morning light. He set the sign in the center of the table. He straightened it so it sat square to the edges. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to work.